Hi, this is Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. One thing you may not know about me is I'm a big science fiction fan. I've probably read every major science fiction novel that's been out there. Maybe not the ones in the last couple of years, but pretty much every historic one. Anyway, one of the famous science fiction books is Endgame by Orson Scott Card, which I read many, many years ago and was made into a movie about 10 years ago. And I had a student I believe from Sweden, whose name was Anders, and he played a very instructive game. So I wrote a Novice Nook about it, and it seemed like the obvious name for the Novice Nook should be Anders Game. So here I'm going to show you Anders Game as a video today. Okay, Anders was white, and he played e4. His opponent played Sicilian, c5. Anders played knight c3. He's going to head toward the Grand Prix attack. d6, f4, the characteristic move of the Grand Prix now, with knight c3 and then e4 and f4 against the Sicilian. Black plays knight c6, white plays knight f3, and black plays the main line, g6. Now, I've had students say to me, how would I know why to play g6 here? And the answer is, well, white's not playing an open Sicilian where he's trading off the c5 pawn, which means black's going to have these three pawns all in a row, kind of blocking the bishop. So it makes sense if you have those three pawns blocking the bishop, that fianchettoing the bishop and getting him to the long diagonal where there's a lot of empty space and a lot of mobility makes a lot of sense. So sometimes, even if you just know opening principles and you don't know what the book moves are, you can figure out that a move like g6 would make a lot of sense. All right, so now the main move for white here is bishop to b5, and that's pretty much what's exclusively played today. Back when I first started playing this, when I was young, bishop c4 was considered also a major line. Not as much today, but that's the line that Anders played, bishop to c4. Okay, black plays e6, a good move, blocking the bishop's diagonal, getting ready to develop the king knight to the e7 square so that the f pawn can be mobile. White castles. Black plays a6, threatening to attack the bishop with b5. If black should do that, white's going to lose all of his ideas for the opening, so he can't allow black to play b5 here, so therefore white naturally and almost required to play a4 to stop b5. All right, so black continues his development with bishop g7. White plays queen e1. This is a book idea to play something like d3 and then queen h4 and then f5 and then bishop h6 and knight g5. If black's not paying attention, that could be a mating attack. One of my friends, Steve Wexler, had a game where he used this to create a mating attack in a tournament game, and he published the game, and the Russians were so impressed with his game that they reprinted his game in Shakhmatny Bulletin, which was the leading chess magazine in the world. And he got a hold of Shakhmatny Bulletin and saw that his game was actually republished in it. So he was very, very happy that he had a game that became like world famous. Anyway, queen to b6, keeping an eye on the king on on g1. Might have to go to h1 with possibilities of black hitting the bishop, and then if the bishop moves, there's a discovery by black moving the c5 pawn. White avoids that idea with king h1. Good idea. You don't want to wait till tactics happen. You want to nip them in the bud. Black plays knight d4. And here white pretty much would think about trading, because the knight is simultaneously not only holding the middle of the board, but he's also threatening knight c2, forking the queen and the rook. Let's ask the computer what the top move is here. Mr. Stockfish. Stockfish says, yep, knight takes d4, only move to really retain much of an advantage. So Anders did play that move. Knight takes. Of course, here black should always take with the pawn. You might say, but that doubles his pawns. If he takes with the bishop's not blocked. He's got a good bishop. Well, yes, but what black really wants is he wants that semi-open file. If you saw my video on the double pawns, you know that if you have the only semi-open file on the board, that can be a big deal. When black plays c takes d4, he gets another pawn in the middle. he gets time to attack the knight on c3. He gets the semi-open c-file. It's just better to take. Let's show you. I bet the computer agrees with me. Computer, take with the pawn. Yep, computer says taking with the pawn gives white only a normal white opening advantage. Taking with the bishop allows the attack to continue with f5, as we talked about a little earlier. Look at that difference. Taking with the pawn is a normal move, and black has 0.4. If he takes with the bishop, white all of a sudden is up 2.4. So it would be a major mistake here to take with the bishop. If you don't understand that, you might want to go back and study this a little bit. But Anders' opponent understood the idea. He took with the pawn. The knight went back toward the middle. This is where we don't want to have that d3 check, winning the knight. If this position had occurred without white playing king h1, black would now play d3 check, hit the knight with a check, and that would be the ball game. All right, so black plays knight e7. As we said, that was one of the ideas of e6, was to block the bishop and to allow the knight to go behind the pawns. This follows the general principle of when you're playing closed positions, you want to keep your pieces behind your pawns. And here the knight on e7 is the better place to put it. White plays d3, again getting ready for that idea of maybe queen h4 followed by f5. Even if he has to sacrifice a pawn to open up that line for the bishop, it's a book idea to do that. Black castles. And now white could play queen h4 or f5. Let's see what the engine says again. Engine says f5 is a move. Right now f5 is number 4. Queen h4, which is the bookie idea, is number 1. Playing a5 to hit the queen is a move. He's jumping back and forth, but all those ideas are right there. White's move, knight g3, is not the best move. He really doesn't need the knight to guard f5. He's going to sack that pawn anyway. And the knight might be able to do better things, and he needs other tempos for his pieces. So knight g3, not the right idea. Black develops his bishop, bishop d7. White hits the queen with a5. The queen goes back to c7. White develops the bishop to d2. Black plays bishop c6. Notice the knight on g3 prevents white from playing his normal queen h4 followed by f5. So white's attack is now slower. White brings the bishop back to b3, guarding the c-pawn. Also possibly saving a tempo later if black plays d5. Black plays rook a e8. Why would you block in your rook on f8? Well, you're only going to do that if you're going to push the f-pawn. And here, playing that pawn to f5 is actually a reasonable idea, but he can't do it right away because the e-pawn would be hanging. If he played f5, white would have bishop takes e6 check. So white plays queen f2, again with ideas of maybe playing f5 at some point. Black plays bishop d7. Why does he do that? Well, it does two things. It opens up the line on the c-file for the queen and the rooks, but it also guards this pawn so that f5 is possible. So if white wants to play f5, he's pretty much got to do it very soon because otherwise black will play f5. And Stockfish here says white's lead is still decent. He should get that knight back out of the way, out of g3, back to e2. And it does say in some of these lines that black should play f5. We could see that f5 popping up. For instance, after white's next move, rook fe1, we could see f5 is black's right now second best move, jumping around again. All right, so let's turn off the engine. So black plays knight c6, and now white decides to go for his f5 break. So he's got the pawn guarded 3 times. It's attacked 3 times. Black can take the pawn. Again, let's turn on the engine. Engine says white is now better since he's got his move in safely. And black should probably take with the e-pawn, but white's up about 1 pawn, which is a pretty big lead. So black plays queen to d8. Now white says, wow, I'd love to play f6, but I can't because it's only guarded once and attacked twice, so he moves the rook over to the f-file. Again, black has to really stop white from doing something like that. And black plays bishop e5, which does not stop f6. Here, the engine is saying now f6, blocking the bishop out and making the dark squares around the king is completely winning at plus 3.5. All right, let's turn off the engine again. Whoops, didn't want to go all the way back. Bishop e5. White plays bishop h6. Well, that's okay. He really doesn't want to take that rook, and that's one of the reasons why I made this game into a Novice Nook and now a video, is that bishop on h6 is better than that rook on f8. Sure, later on, maybe 40 moves from now, that rook in the endgame could be better, and white can win the game by taking the rook and trading, being up the exchange, and then he could trade everything off and try to win himself. But in this kind of position, that bishop's actually better than the rook. So from instantaneous value, you really aren't in a position where you really want to take the rook. It's not that it's a bad move, it's just that you have better things you can do. So black, of course, saves the exchange by playing bishop g7, and white guards the bishop with queen to d2. So again, if we turn on the engine and we ask it to evaluate, it says black should stop white from playing f6 at some point by playing f6 himself, and white has a big advantage of about 1.8 here. But now black makes a terrible, terrible mistake. He's down 1.8, but he's about to go down a lot more than that. He plays queen h4. Why is that bad? Well, because his queen is out in nowhere land, and now Anders recognizes that rather than trading off the fianchettoed bishop, bishop takes g7, which is what a lot of amateurs like to do. They love to trade off fianchettoed bishops by playing queen d2 and bishop h6. They think that's, whenever somebody fianchettos, you play queen d2 and bishop h6 and you trade off the bishops. Well, that's not true. There are some lines like that in the dragon, or maybe the 150 attack in the Pierce defense. But in general, that's not how you play against fianchettoed bishops. It's not like it's terrible, but it's not like you have to do that. And here, it would be a major mistake for white to play bishop takes g7. So he plays a move that's much, much, much better. He plays bishop g5 and says, oh, by the way, Mr. Queen, you just came out there. How are you going to get back? And the queen only has one safe move, which is queen to g4. And now instead of trading off the bishop, Anders does another really good move, and he puts the bishop out of the game permanently with f6. The last two moves for white has increased his advantage from like 1 point after black messed up and he took advantage of it. Look at the advantage now. Now we're not talking about 1.8 anymore. The computer has white up by like 7.1. So white's completely winning, and black has to save the bishop. He plays bishop h8. So now the question is, why is white winning? Well, Anders thought he was winning for one reason, but his reason that he thought he was winning for was completely wrong. And let's talk about this. When I wrote my article on this game, I spent about 20% of the article on this move, explaining what's going on here. Right now, black's pieces are terrible, but especially the bishop on h8. When you have a piece out of the game like that, if you can maintain that pawn on f6, and here white can easily maintain the pawn on f6, then you're basically up a piece. You could just play the rest of the game, keep an eye on that pawn on f6, and as long as that bishop can't get out, you're basically just up a piece, and you could play the game as if you're up a piece, and you can just win the game up a piece. The other reason that white's winning is this queen is trapped. This queen on g4 doesn't have any moves. So all you have to do is safely attack it. But how do you do that? If you attack it with the h-pawn and play h3, he has queen takes g3. Now you still may be able to trap the queen with a move like h3, queen takes g3, rook f3. Or you could reverse those moves. You could play rook f3 first with the idea that you're going to play h3 and then trap the queen. So rook f3 becomes a major candidate move. How did I arrive at that? Well, I just did a little logic. I said if I play h3, he can play queen takes g3. Maybe I can trap the rook with rook f3. If I looked at the sequence ABC, maybe the sequence CBA is even better. So maybe rook f3 threatening h3 is like unstoppable, and maybe I can win the queen. Well, there are some ways the queen could try to wriggle out a little bit when you play rook f3. We could play rook f3 as a sideline and show you what black might do. Let's turn on the engine. The engine says black should play knight e5 hitting the rook. And now if you play h3, he can play knight takes f3 winning, hitting your queen. So you can't do that. All right, so that's a sideline that doesn't work right away. All right, but there's other ways of trapping the queen. For instance, you could attack it with a different piece than the pawn on h3. Maybe you don't want to put the rook on f3 and then play h3. Well, what other piece can attack the queen on g4? And the answer is, oh, that's not that hard. How about the bishop on b3? All we need to do is play bishop d1 and the queen is trapped. Oh, but we have a pawn on c2 blocking the bishop. Well, that means we have candidate moves like c3 and c4 with the idea that on the next move we're going to play bishop d1 and trap the queen. For instance, if we play c3 and black says, aha, I'm going to play e5 so that if you play bishop d1 I can play the queen back to e6, white could actually throw a monkey wrench in the way now. He can throw the knight onto that square so the queen can't get back, and when the pawn takes, he can play bishop d1, trapping the queen, and now the queen has to sacrifice itself for one of the bishops, and you end up winning the queen for a knight and a bishop. So that would be a way of trapping the queen. This is how you play chess. You play chess with your imagination and try to figure out why you're winning. Well, so now we see that white has two ways of winning. The easy way of winning is to just keep that bishop on h8 out of the game, and then you're just up a piece and you win. The more fun way of winning is to try to trap the queen on g4. And in fact, you can do both those things. You can keep the bishop on h8 out of the game and simultaneously try to keep the bishop trapped on h8. And that's why the computer says that in this position, white is up by like 7.2 pawns. All right, so here white plays bishop to h6, which by itself isn't a terrible move. In fact, if we go back and look at the top moves, bishop h6 is one of the moves, but the whole idea of bishop h6 is to continue to keep the bishop on h8 out of the game and to try to trap the queen. The problem is Anders doesn't understand that. He thinks the main idea here is to win the exchange and to win the rook. But that bishop on g5 is helping trap the queen, and it's guarding the pawn on f6, keeping the bishop out of the game. The bishop's worth like 3.5 pawns. Winning the exchange is only worth about half that, about 1 3/4. So keeping the bishop out of the game is way, way, way more powerful than winning the exchange here. That rook on f8 being especially terrible at the moment, it has no moves. So bishop h6, I gave it a question mark, but as you can see, it's not really a bad move. It's just a bad idea if your idea is to take that rook. All right, so black plays g5, trying to block the bishop out of the game. And now, believe it or not, if white just takes that pawn, the best move, I think, is to take it with the bishop and keep the bishop out of the game and then go for some of those ideas. Now, the queen isn't as easily trapped now because it has the g6 square. It can play back there somehow, but the knight is stopping the queen from going to h5. So you could just play bishop takes g5 as a monster move, and you're just killing him. Or you could play queen takes g5 check, and instead of trapping the queen, trade the queens, winning a pawn, and after queen takes g5 check, queen takes g5, bishop takes g5, you're not only keeping the bishop on h8 out of the game permanently, but you're also up a pawn on the rest of the board as well. So here, bishop takes g5 to try to trap the queen is probably the best move. Queen takes g5 check is good, but not the best move. If we look at the top 5 moves here, the top 2 moves are the ones that trap the queen, c3 and c4. Doing nothing and just playing king g1 is number 3. Playing rook f2 and maybe doubling your rooks on the f file to keep the bishop out of the game is number 4. And just bringing the rook on a1 into the game, rook ae1, is number 5. Notice that bishop takes f8 is not one of the top 5 moves. It just doesn't make any sense here. But, you know, lower rated players, that's how they play. They evaluate positions just on material. But here, material is actually not the main thing that's driving the evaluation of the position. It's the fact that white's pieces are monstrously good, the black queen is monstrously bad, the bishop on h8 is completely out of the game, and white's army is much more active. Well, winning that rook actually gets rid of some of those ideas where you can trap the bishop, and where you can block the queen, and where you can win the pawn on g5. All those ideas kind of go away once you play bishop takes f8. So look at the evaluation. Right now the evaluation is 9.4. If you take the rook, obviously white's still winning, But look how much it drops when he does that. Goes down from 9.4 to 5.9. You can see the evaluation up here at the top in green if you don't know where to look. Or you can look at the one right above that here where it says Stockfish 14. So it's not like White's losing now. 5.9, that's pretty good. The bishop's still out of the game. All these good things happening. But this wasn't the right idea at all. And that's one of the main ideas of the video. All right, let's play through the rest of the game. We've already used 20 minutes on the video. We'll see how White's advantage slowly disappears as the game goes on. So king takes f8. White says, let's trade queens. I'm up the exchange. Black says, okay. White trades. White plays knight h5 to try to guard that pawn because the knight and the bishop are guarding it. Black hits the rook. The rook goes up to f2. Rook goes on the semi-open file. White plays rook e2. Not sure why. The rook was guarding the f-pawn. Black says, would you like a draw? Now White should re-guard the pawn and keep guarding that pawn with the rook or the other rook. Instead, he goes for a trade of bishops, but now he lets the bishop out of the bag on f6. So bishop takes, rook takes, knight f6. Now that bishop's not trapped on h8 anymore. So White trades being up the exchange, but now Black has a bishop and a pawn for the rook. It's a bishop and he has 8 pawns, White only has 7. So White's lead here, if we turn on the engine real quickly here, is down all the way to 2.3. See, he was just trying to trade, and he let that bishop back in the game. Now it's not going to be so easy, and it continues to deteriorate. Rook c4, rook c5, hitting the pawn, and now White undoubles Black's pawns, making Black even a little bit better. Now White should bring the king to the middle and start fighting. The king is almost as strong as the rook here. Instead, he plays rook e1, bishop d8 hitting the pawn, rook a1 guarding the pawn, king e7. Rook a4, he's really not going anywhere. He needs to play with the king. King d6, Black's king is pretty active. Kings are worth about 4.25 in the endgame. White plays king to g1, finally realizing I can't play without my king. King c6, and now Black's threatening king b5, double attacking that pawn on a5 and hitting the rook. And he's going to win that pawn, and now he'll have a bishop and 2 pawns for the rook. And by Reinfeld count, that would be even. By more sophisticated counts, that might even be better too. So king f2, king b5, rook comes back, bishop takes. All right, White. Now White has basically no advantage. King f3, h5 to keep the king out. Rook to a1. Bishop back c7, hitting the pawn on h3. Pawn goes up to save. Bishop e5. Now, if White kind of does nothing, he might be able to save a draw. Rook f1. I think now both sides were getting in time pressure because early in the game it had been pretty complicated. King e2. That's one other reason why I don't want to comment too much on this endgame. It's a little bit not fair to the players because at this point they didn't have a lot of time. White's threatening rook takes f7, winning. Black saves the pawn with f6. White has nothing to do with the rook. There's no entrance into Black's position. White's just moving back and forth because he's slow on time. b5, Black says, let me try to win with my extra 2 pawns. Let's move back and forth. Black tries to break with the c pawn. Let's turn on the engine again. At this point, the engine says Black is now better. White should play either b3 or g4, but Black's close to winning now at minus 1.2. So with White low on time and with Black having all the winning chances, it's going to be really hard to defend this position. White plays rook to a2. Black keeps pushing the pawns. White tries to defend. Black takes the pawn. White doesn't even take back. I guess he was worried if he takes back that king to b3 would win his b2 pawn, so he moves his king up. Black plays there, saying if you take the pawn with check, I'll play king b3, winning your b2 pawn anyway. White tries to stop him with rook a3. Black says, where are you going, Mr. King? King tries to keep guarding the c pawn. Black says, now I have a passed pawn. Things are getting ugly for White now. White tries to check, but that pawn is attacked twice. King hits the rook, still attacking the b pawn twice, but also hitting the rook. removes the guard on the rook. Black says, thanks for another pawn. White says, but I can get it back if I pin it. Black says, I'll get out of the pin. White says, okay, I win my pawn back. Black says, let me block the king out of the game permanently. White plays check. Black says, I'm going to attack your pawn. If you try to guard it with rook b2, I'll just bring my king up. And you're going to run out of moves. And I think here maybe white lost on time. I forget. But you could see white's losing. Minus 1 point. He says he should play rook a6. Minus 1.6. Well, you know, now it's minus 2.6, 2.1. You know, black's probably winning here. But white lost. And if we go back to our position here, we have a trapped queen. We have the bishop out of the game. Here, white's position had reached its apex. He's got the queen trapped. All he has to do is keep that bishop out of the game, even if he doesn't figure out how to trap the queen. You know, this is a very instructive position. You could put this in your study book and analyze it with an engine, analyze it with a friend. You know, white's killing black here. He has all kinds of ways to win. And by winning the exchange here, bishop h6, as I said, wasn't really a bad move, but now he shouldn't take the rook. As I said, wasn't even in the top 5. Taking the rook, again, white's still winning. But now he has all the wrong ideas, and he slowly flitters it away here, especially when he lets black take off that pawn right here. He gets that pawn, and now it's a whole different game. All right, so Ender's Game, patterned after the science fiction book Ender's Game. I think a very instructive game. If you learn the lessons from this game and learn a little bit more about, you know, what it takes to evaluate a position and when to be materialistic and when not, this game I think will help a lot toward that end. Okay, if you haven't subscribed, you can subscribe. We have 5,000 subscribers now. Thanks very much for helping with that. You can like the video, but even more, you can tell your friends about the channel. Thanks a lot. We'll see you next time. Bye.